We have now learned about the attack on Washington, D.C., and the Battle of Baltimore and Fort McHenry. I'm going to read several sentences about these two events. I want to see if you can figure out which event these sentences are about. If the event was part of the Battle of Baltimore, I want you to say Baltimore. If the sentence that I read is about the attack on Washington, D.C., I want you to say Washington. All right, let's try it with our first one. During this battle, President Madison left the president's house to be with the troops. That was Washington, the attack on Washington. Second, during this battle, important papers and a portrait of George Washington were removed from the president's house before it was burned. That one was also the attack on Washington, D.C. Third, during this battle, Francis Scott Key wrote a poem that became our national anthem. That one was the Battle of Baltimore. Our national anthem is called the Star-Spangled Banner. Number 4. During this battle, British troops burned the president's house. That was the attack on Washington, D.C. And our last one, number 5. During this battle, a very large flag flew over Fort McHenry. That was the Battle of Baltimore. Mary Pickersgill made that very large flag to fly over the fort. All right, we are going to learn about another battle that actually happened after the War of 1812 was over. Before we learn about this battle, we need to go over our vocabulary words. Truce. A truce is an agreement to stop fighting or arguing. My brother and I called a truce to end our water balloon fight. Retreated. Retreated means moved backward to avoid danger. The kitten retreated to his basket when he heard the thunder. Strategically. Strategically means carefully planned to meet a specific goal. We strategically planned our route to school so we would get there in time. Astonished. Astonished means full of surprise or amazement. I was astonished when I saw my friend jump into the pool with his shoes still on. I'm going to read several sentences. If you find the statement hard to believe and you would be astonished, I want you to say, I would be astonished. If you do not find the statement hard to believe and you would not be astonished, say, I would not be astonished. All right, first one. I saw an elephant sitting on a bench in the park. It was dark during the daytime and sunny at night. It was snowing when I woke up one morning. I saw 3 cats and a dog flying over the school. We saw a blue whale in the river. Think about a time when you have felt astonished and turn and tell whoever is helping you today about it. Grandfather Lafitte, JP, and Adele settled back around the table on their grandfather's front porch. As they shared a plateful of chocolate chip cookies and some cold lemonade, they relaxed in the warm sunshine. The ginger barn cow was purring, curled up beneath the table. "The War of 1812 was not quite over," started Grandfather Lafitte as he took a sip of his lemonade. "There was to be one more big victory for us. Remember, the British had a three-part plan of attack for the War of 1812. The first part was to move from Canada into the state of New York. The second part was to attack coastal cities such as Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. We've already learned about those two battles. We'll learn about the third part today." Grandfather Lafitte continued. "Remember, the final part of the British three-part plan was to attack the city of New Orleans and gain control of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is one of the world's major rivers." "Was New Orleans an important port too?" asked JP, who had already devoured 3 cookies and was now eating an apple. "It certainly was. It was one of the largest cities in America, and it was an important trading center. Farmers could ship their goods down the Mississippi River to the port of New Orleans. Ships transported these goods far and wide. Not only that, the Ohio, Missouri, and Tennessee rivers fed into the Mississippi River. That means that farmers as far away as Ohio, as well as settlers moving west, had a way of sending and receiving goods. Important supplies could be taken all across the United States on what was essentially a series of water highways." "Oh, I see," said JP. "If the British captured New Orleans, they would be able to stop that trade. That would not have been good for the farmers or the merchants." "You're absolutely right," said Grandfather Lafitte, cracking a proud smile at his grandson. "This was a battle we could not afford to lose." A man named General Andrew Jackson was asked to put together an army and go to New Orleans to defend it. And that's exactly what he did. Actually, Jackson's army was a ragtag group of militiamen from Louisiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Ragtag means made up of different people or things, and not organized or put together well. He had some trained soldiers, but to help them he recruited anyone and everyone he could. Farmers, Native Americans, African Americans, even pirates. "Pirates!" exclaimed Adele. "You said pirates were part of the story. Grandad, is this when you tell us about the pirates?" "Almost," Grandfather Lafitte replied. "But first I want to tell you about the Battle of New Orleans. Then I'll have plenty to tell you about pirates." Now, during the summer of 1814, the British started building up a larger invasion force. With the Napoleonic Wars almost over, the British had more soldiers to spare. They now had more than twice as many soldiers as the Americans. "How could we beat such a huge army?" asked JP, astonished. "Listen, and I'll tell you all about it," urged Grandfather Lafitte. In early December of 1814, General Andrew Jackson arrived in New Orleans. People were in a state of panic. The British Navy had already begun to destroy some of the city's defenses. Then, just 2 days before Christmas, General Jackson got word that the British Army was only 8 miles from New Orleans. He ordered the construction of entrenchments, or defensive walls, across the swampy land around the city. He got as many people as he could to dig these defensive walls. "That was smart of him," said JP. "As it turned out, it really was," replied Grandfather Lafitte. Over the next several days and weeks, there were many military encounters between both sides. However, the deciding battle, which became known as the Battle of New Orleans, took place in early January in a wooded area south of the city. The British were moving toward the city, but what they did not know was that some of Andrew Jackson's best soldiers were strategically positioned along the defensive walls that had been built around the city. These soldiers were armed with much better weapons than the British soldiers had. General Andrew Jackson's men also had about a dozen cannons. The cannons Grandfather Lafitte was talking about are similar to the ones in this image from a reenactment of the battle. Did the British know that they were outgunned? Asked JP. No, they didn't. At least, not at first, replied Grandfather Lafitte. One group of British soldiers advanced at dawn across an open field between the Mississippi River and an area of swampland. Unfortunately for the British, their commanding officer did not survive that effort. Without a leader to take the commanding officer's place, there was a great deal of confusion on the battlefield. Before long, the British soldiers realized that they were in trouble. Did they surrender? Inquired Adele. Yes, essentially, agreed Grandfather Lafitte. By this time, hundreds of British soldiers had been lost or injured. The British had no choice. They raised a white flag. The white flag is a signal recognized around the world for surrender or giving up. As the smoke cleared, the firing stopped. It seemed that one British officer even stepped forward and offered his sword to a U.S. commanding officer as a sign of truce. Overall, compared to the British, we lost very few soldiers in the Battle of New Orleans. The British retreated, but they stayed in their encampment near the battlefield for several more days. No more shots were fired by either side. Eventually, the British withdrew their ships and sailed away. The Battle of New Orleans was perhaps our greatest victory, but it was not the last battle of the War of 1812. The last battle was in February 1815 at Fort Boyer. At the entrance of Mobile Bay, near what is now Alabama, the British won that battle and were considering another attack on New Orleans. But before they did, they received the news that a peace treaty had been signed in Europe. The war was officially over. I don't understand, Granddad, said JP. Didn't you say that the war was already over, but both sides were still fighting? How could that be? Asked Adele. Well, I'll explain, said Grandfather Lafitte. The previous September, after the Battle of Baltimore, both sides began to work on a peace treaty. That peace treaty was eventually signed on Christmas Eve, December 24, 1814. But back then, news traveled very, very slowly. Remember, the Battle of New Orleans was after Christmas. The news of the peace treaty did not reach the troops in time to prevent the Battle of New Orleans or the attack on Fort Boyer. That's too bad, said Adele. Those soldiers wouldn't have been hurt if they'd known about the peace treaty, she said. Yes, that's true, replied Grandfather Lafitte. But there was a positive effect from the battles, such as the Battle of New Orleans. Some historians say the War of 1812 was America's second war for independence. That's because successful battles like the Battle of New Orleans did help us to believe in ourselves as a strong nation. What happened after the war? Asked Adele. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about the peace treaty itself. And we mustn't forget about those pirates, replied Grandfather. The children settled back down in their chairs and waited for Grandfather Lafitte to continue. We've talked a little bit about the saying, where there's a will, there's a way. This is a proverb. Remember, proverbs are short traditional sayings that have been passed along orally from generation to generation. These sayings usually express general truths based on experiences and observations of everyday life. While some are literal, meaning that they mean exactly what they say, some have a richer meaning. Where there's a will, there's a way means that if you're determined to do something, you will find a way to do it. Andrew Jackson knew that the Battle of New Orleans was a very important battle. If the British won, they'd gain control of the Mississippi River. He could not let that happen. He directed that entrenchments be built around the city and put together an army of militiamen, soldiers, Native Americans, African Americans, farmers, and even pirates, whatever it took. He was determined to win. Alright, my friends, let's get to our questions about this story. Why did the British want to gain control of the Mississippi River? The Mississippi River was a very important trading link that connected important cities across the United States. This is how a lot of places got their supplies, and the British believed that if they could cut off those supplies, the United States would struggle. 2 days before Christmas, the British Army was just 8 miles from the city of New Orleans. What did General Jackson do when he heard this? Right. General Jackson ordered for large walls or defensive walls to be built. Those were called entrenchments. What was the Battle of New Orleans? Was the Battle of New Orleans the only battle fought after the war ended? No. The last battle of the War of 1812 was actually fought at Fort Boyer in Alabama. Alright, my friends, the title of our story today was called The Battle After the War. What do you think? Do you think that's a good title for this story? Why or why not? Alright, my friends, there is no physical assignment for you to turn in today, but there is one more thing we're going to do. We are going to listen to a song called The Battle of New Orleans. In this song, we're going to hear names of some of the people and places that we learned about so far in this domain. I want you to listen carefully to our story and see if you can notice all of the things we've already talked about. When the song is over, I want you to turn to whoever is helping you today and summarize the action that's described in the song. When you are done with that description, you are all done with knowledge for today, and I will see you guys next time.
Well, in 1814 we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we met the bloody British near the town of New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, I seed Mars Jackson a-walking down the street and a-talking to a pirate by the name of Gene Lafitte. He gave Gene a drink that he brung from Tennessee, and the pirate said he'd help us drive the British in the sea. The French told Andrew, you'd better run, for a packet ham's a-coming with a bullet in his gun. Old Hickory said he didn't give it, a-gonna whip the britches off of Colonel Pakenham. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we looked down the river and we see the British come, and there must have been 100 of them beating on the drum. They stepped so high and they made their bugles ring while we stood beside our cotton bales, didn't say a thing. Old Hickory said we'd take 'em by surprise if we didn't fire a musket till we looked 'em in the eyes. We held our fire till we see their faces well, then we opened up our squirrel guns and really gave 'em hell. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch 'em on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we fired our cannon till the barrel melted down, so we grabbed an alligator and we fought another round. We filled his head with many balls and powdered his behind, and when we touched the powder off, the gator lost his mind. They lost their pants and their pretty shiny coats, and their tails were all a-showing like a bunch of billy goats. They run down the river with their tongues hanging out, and they said they got a licking, which there wasn't any doubt. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to run it on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we marched back to town in our dirty ragged pants, and we danced all night with them pretty girls from France. We couldn't understand them, but they had the sweetest charms, and we understood them better when we got them in our arms. The guide who brung the British from the sea came a-limping into camp just as sick as he could be. He said the dying words of the Colonel Pakenham was, "You better quit your fooling with your cousin Uncle Sam." We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we'll march back home, but we'll never be content till we make old Hickory the people's president. And every time we think about the bacon and the beans, we'll think about the fun we had way down in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.